commissioner, huh?
Yeah.
Did you at least show up to your appointment? That's the most frustrating part.
I did.
You tired of being,
She
you
texts
don't want to
me
be
every
the,
morning
want to be
of my
the
appointment
sole
day, so I don't
realtor
forget.
on the board, is that what
I
it
got very
is?
used to me being a harebrained. I just tell her I was in an airplane accident, she forgives me.
You'll be able to play that card for
Yeah,
a while.
yeah.
I saw you you playing a show here in a couple weeks though.
Yeah.
Are you doing guitar, singing the whole thing?
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah, and I'm gonna have a like a stool up there if I need it. But we've got our cares are over. It's just us now. And he said I'll be lifting weights by July. So I've healed really well. Yeah, it's been amazing. No more pain, just sore. You know.
Even with the rods in your back and everything?
The rods, yeah. Yeah, they stay forever. Check this out. I got pictures.
So what, you're probably cheating in the weight room now, huh? You got like
No, I have.
titanium in there. You're gonna be able to squat like 800
I have not
pounds,
been in the
nothing.
weight room.
She might have told me that she was going to be gone.
This is the frontal view,
You did?
and then that's the
I have not.
side
Oh,
view.
he usually texts.
But it's not wicked.
We'll go ahead and get started. We're missing a couple members, but
And then
usually we get a couple that usually show up a little late.
that's the frontal.
We'll go ahead and get started. Bruce, good to have you back. I hope
Thank you.
I hope your wife's doing well.
She's doing wonderful. The surgery went great.
Good, good. So we'll go ahead and start with council follow-up. Carter, do you have anything?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I do not have anything for that item.
Did you want to bring that up now or around the table about the Parkway funds?
I'll bring it up around the table.
Okay, perfect.
Can I ask a question though?
Yes.
Last week you guys talked about the fountain apparently when I was gone. I was really curious when I saw them tearing that down today, why, when we were looking at a $6 million retrofit to protect this building, why would we take those walls down and give somebody a clean shot at the council room now?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that's a fair question. What you're seeing is the removal of the pool facility.
I saw that.
And the sculpture itself will remain in place and hopefully will be restored, if you will, pursuant to some private funding that hopefully we'll be able to secure. The pool facility, however, is one that we do not plan to use moving into the future because it's in need of some fairly significant repairs, and one that I can't say has much value for you to consider, particularly given the operational costs that it incurs every year and so on. And so given that the pool essentially is being decommissioned, we proposed to the council that it be removed, which was in keeping with the scope of the original City Hall project, was that it would go away. Given that the sculpture will still be there, however, we think that from a security standpoint, particularly in concert with the other improvements we wanted to make, which would be the bollards in the sidewalk areas and so on, we think that security will actually be enhanced.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so that's the idea in general.
Thank you.
You bet.
Anything else for follow-up? Okay, we'll move on to Bar and Grill presentation. It's Carter.
All right, thank you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mayor.
Mayor. As you will recall, we have one more bar and grill license available, and that became known to us back during the February renewal process. And it was at that time that council asked for an application process to be opened, if you will, with a fairly lengthy lead time, which is what brings us to where we're at today. We've had one application. Mr. Childs is here in that regard, and I've asked Fleur to kind of set the stage for us so that indeed she can give you some details and questions can be had either of the city clerk or the applicant.
Great. Fleur.
Your Honor, members of council. So we did receive one application for a bar and grill license, and it is for La Cocina. Their plan is to move to the east side over at the Compass. I have a couple renderings that I can pull up. So this just kind of shows where it will be in relation to, this is the bank over there, and then Metro and the copy areas are back behind, and then that's La Cocina. And you can kind of see the other buildings in the background of that one. So we received one application. They plan to have about 100 to 112 seats in their facility, and the build will take place this year, starting this year, and they should be done by March of 2023. The cost for this license, is $10,500, and pursuant to getting this, they would move their location to this facility. I'm here to answer any questions you may have, and also the owner, Mr. Jim Childs, is here as well.
Awesome. Questions? Lisa? Any questions for Jim or for either?
I have a
told me to
question for
stand
Jim. Do you have adequate parking?
According to the city and Brick and Bond, there is adequate parking per your guys' requirements.
Just looked a little bit tight for 112 seats.
Your Honor, this is over across the street from the Loaf and Jug over, there's 15th Wyoming Boulevard and then Centennial Hills, that little corridor, and then the Hilltop Bank is right here. So this is that Centennial Hills, and then the gas station is over here. That's the Hilltop Bank, and then they would be right there. And then there's that parking lot. And so some of these businesses are obviously closed in the evening. So I think that's where the
I was going to point that out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
so what I'm assuming too, and that's exactly what I was gonna say, so if you look at all that parking, it's all over there by Hilltop and up and down, that whole entire area can be utilized for parking, I think, for La Cocina and other establishments, right, Jim?
And then I think we're talking maybe putting a parking pad here for employees. But that, we just talked about that yesterday at our meeting.
That's also where the winery is, right, or whatever it is?
Okay.
Okay.
Right, it's
Yeah.
just back in this
Okay.
piece.
So as much hell as we got from the neighbors for letting them put in a high upscale winery, what's gonna happen with that? Or have you already got it, it's already zoned and you're ready to go?
Your Honor,
Where-
the zoning is correct
Oh, okay.
for this area.
Then you'll be okay.
Yeah, I didn't know. I'm like, yeah, I think so.
We got a lot of hell over the winery part. But
Go ahead.
just one more question. So the license will sit until March of next year until the building is open, is that?
Yeah, we wouldn't use it, and if I needed to buy it now, I'll buy it now. But it won't be used at that location until then. We wouldn't be prepared to use it at our location now because
Well,
we
just
don't-
as a follow-up, how's that gonna work if he needs to purchase it now, doesn't need to acquire it? Otherwise, we still have an open license and it'll be game for anybody else that walks in the door looking for one. So I think you're actually gonna have to move on purchasing it almost immediately if the council approves it.
Okay, and then it becomes mine and no one can apply for it.
That's
correct?
right, that's
Okay.
right. But then there's also some constraints on it. I mean, you can't sit on it for 2 years and not use it and
Well, no, we'll
things
be
like
open
that.
by
so-
April 1st.
Right, right. I just wanted you to be aware that there are
Okay.
those.
Lisa?
What are your plans with your existing license?
It's just a restaurant license. It'll just go back
Okay.
into the.
We have
pool.
unlimited
Yeah.
of those.
Yeah. Steve?
I guess my only concern is you made the comment about in the evenings, that's gonna be a zoo at lunch. Just saying.
Well, it's private enterprise, man. Go get it.
I understand. But no, that deal right there with the in and out to, what is it, Y-High? The credit union that's just down at the bottom part of the corner, in and out of the Loaf and Jug, and in and out of what is there, and Casper Orthopedics. Something from a traffic standpoint needs to be done there, because you've got a left turn lane going into Loaf and Jug or the street coming from the east going west, and you also have a left turn lane at the Casper Orthopedics, which is to turn in there, but there are no left or right turns into that first parking lot right there, and it winds up with people backed up to Outer Drive right now, trying to turn into those places.
Steve Frill.
Well, the only thing I'd add to that is you come out of that parking lot, it's a right turn only that goes to, on the Centennial Hills Boulevard or 15th Street out to Wyoming Boulevard. So coming out of that parking lot's not gonna be an issue.
I'm not worried about coming out, I'm worried about going in and clearing that intersection and those lanes for Outer Drive.
Jim, can you tell?
Is that a YDOT thing or is that a city thing?
That's a city thing once it goes from the concrete to the asphalt coming off of Wyoming Boulevard.
Jim, what are your lunches like? I mean, do you see like an overflow of a bunch of people at lunches?
I think at this location, not being on the one-way and being in the kind of location I'm in now,
Yeah.
I think we'll see
An increase?
dramatic increase, yeah, in revenue and people.
I guess the pragmatic stance I would take, while I understand where Steve is coming from, is that, one, I agree with Bruce for enterprise, but I also think we need to take a look and see what this is going to be like and go through it, because I think this is a wonderful opportunity for this east side of Casper. Obviously, we're always, talking about downtown. This is a great opportunity for the east side. But I think we need to take a look and give it a little bit to see if this is going to be a problem, if this is going to be something that we're going to have to re-examine after a while. Lisa?
Honestly, at lunchtime, the problem's gonna fix itself because lack of parking, then people just simply won't be able to go there. So it might just fix itself just by the lack of parking, so you might have more of a dinner crowd than a lunch crowd.
Mr. Mayor, I would also add that when the development went in, there were traffic studies that were required as a part of that subdivision, if you will. And so I don't believe that since the capacity of that parking lot is not increasing, that it would necessarily conflict with the results of that particular study. So, I certainly agree with the applicant that if that parking lot is put in the back there, kind of towards would that be the
Towards the east.
if you will, yeah, that would certainly help alleviate some of the pressure on the parking area. But I don't expect that we'll see a lot of difference with regard to what this traffic study originally anticipated.
And we need to give it some time to see that once Jim gets open and running to see, because if it's a lunchtime, it's crazy, then we can reevaluate what that looks like down the road. So, Your parking was terrible over at your old place too, and it wasn't great over there either on that one place, was it?
It took up a lot of street parking, yeah.
Yeah.
Which isn't great.
Yeah. Any other questions for Jim or Fleur or Carter? Yeah, Carter.
I got a question, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor. Mr. Childs, do you happen to have a feel yet for what will happen with the current building?
It's for sale. Keith Garlick and I own that together.
Gotcha.
And I think he's reaching out more towards the people that want to be on the high traffic of the interstate, like a large franchise of some kind. Not necessarily a restaurant either, just anything that would benefit from being right there on the highway. So that's as much as I know right now.
Anything else for anybody? Okay. Do you need a thumbs up for us to move forward with this, Carter?
Mr. Mayor, basically what would happen is if council's comfortable with us taking this to the floor for formal consideration, we'll get that ready and be ready for probably the 7th. Is that fair?
We'll establish on the 7th for the 21st.
Okay.
Council meeting to pass it.
Is everybody comfortable with moving forward, getting on the floor? Okay. Thanks, Jim.
When do I give you the money or what? I don't.
Jim, if you want to go ahead and
what we're doing here.
Jim, go ahead and write the check, give it to me.
Oh, okay, all right, okay.
You just go ahead and we'll just go.
Make
back
it out
to
to
it.
me, just give it to Ray.
Okay, all right.
They'll reach out to you.
All right.
It's Knell.
Okay.
Right. Yes, I do.
Thanks, Jim.
Uh-huh.
All right, cemetery
Thanks,
ordinance
guys.
changes. Thanks. Have a good night.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we have a proposal for you to consider as it relates to changes with the way in which the cemetery has its fee structure organized right now. There certainly are a few critical changes that we want you to be aware of right at the outset here. A lot of which you will see summarized in your spreadsheet that looks like this in your packet. The changes are in red, by the way, on that packet. A couple things I wanted you to be aware of, however, as we move into this conversation. Zulim and her team did a really good job of comparing what it is that we're asking for in relation to what a number of other cemeteries, publicly held, are doing around the Mountain West region. Also, I'd have you know that that if indeed you do approve of these changes, we are only anticipating that our cost recovery would improve to about 46%, whereas our goal is 50%. So even with these changes, we don't anticipate that on an average basis each year we would actually hit the goal that we have in mind for that operation. This operation is a little different, however, in that it's not set up as like an enterprise like many of your other operations are, particularly in Zulima's department. However, nonetheless, we do like to try to keep an eye on that where we can and give you recommendations accordingly. So with that, if I could get Zulima up to talk about some of these changes in a little more specific detail, some things to be aware of and kind of keep a heads up for, I would appreciate that.
Perfect. Zulima.
Mayor, members of council, thanks for having me tonight. As the city manager indicated, we are looking at making some changes at the Highland Cemetery, and particularly with how we utilize the resolution to manage our operations, as well as to establish our rates. And so I apologize, the title is a little misleading because it's not an ordinance change, it's a resolution change. But ultimately, we are hoping that you will support a concept of kind of truncating the existing resolution, which is about 18 to 20 pages, and includes a great deal of administrative items. It talks about what our hours of operation for the office are and what time people need to call in order to schedule services for the next day or for the weekend. It gets really down in the weeds as far as how we operate the day-to-day facilities of the cemetery. And so what we're hoping to accomplish is to remove that administrative stuff into policies and procedures guidance that we will use internally to manage the operation, and leave the resolution for the more important items, such as establishing the rates that we're going to charge, as well as establishing the cost recovery goal, which we're proposing tonight should be at about 50%. And again, as the city manager indicated, we don't operate the cemetery fund as an individual fund. It is part of the city's general fund, and the revenue that is earned from cemetery operations goes directly into the revenue fund. But we do track those expenses and revenues in a way that allow us to determine exactly how much that operation is subsidized by the general fund. So in your memo, you'll see over the last couple of years, our subsidy really ranges from about 30% to in FY21, we did reach 52% cost recovery, so 48% subsidized. But we do attribute that higher bump that year to COVID. So we feel like in FY20, which included 4 months of COVID restrictions and limitations on the gatherings that were allowed, including funeral services, that some of that ceased, and so events, celebrations of life that would have happened in that time frame were pushed off 6 months, 12 months, 18 months into the following fiscal year. And so we did see that big increase in FY21. Also important to note that we did increase rates effective July 1, 2018, and then again January 1st, 2020, but of course we wouldn't have realized that rate increase in January of 2020 fully, because in March things shut down. So we do feel that that's a little bit artificial. However, coming into projections for FY22 and our predictions for FY23, we feel like 45 to 50% is really attainable for us as a cost recovery. We're making concerted efforts to reduce our expenses, personnel, irrigation costs, those kinds of things, to be more effective in our operation as we possibly can, so that the results of the rate increases that we're proposing will be maximized in our cost recovery opportunities. So again, we're asking you to support the 50% goal for our cost recovery and establishing that goal in resolution, so it's a little more memorialized. And then we want to change rates effective July 1, which would of course impact FY23 revenues. So as the city manager indicated, this chart, and you have the benefit of color and I do not, does summarize all of the rates that are charged in a cemetery operation. And under the Casper proposed column, everything in red is what we're actually proposing to change. And I do want to note that some of the rates, of course, would increase. Generally speaking, those rates are more in the category of purchasing plots or land or space at the cemetery in order to do burials, cremains, those kinds of things. But we are also proposing a couple of reductions, and that is to closely align with what the comparables are to other entities throughout this region, as well as to consider the feedback that we've gotten from some of our customer base recently about the fees that we charge. So what we did was took all of the averages from the comps that include states Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Montana. And again, we tried to compare that to our current rates and then adjust our rates to closely align with that in a way that we felt was fair and equitable. In some cases, we're a little below. In some cases, we may be just a little high. And certainly, if you have questions about those, I'm happy to answer those. And my team is here to answer any detailed questions you might have that I can't answer. One of the big items that we're actually looking to reduce would be a reduction in weekend and holiday fees. So right now we do charge a premium if people want to have their graveside service on an evening or on a weekend. And that's mostly to cover the operational overtime expenses that we incur in those instances. However, we feel like an adjustment down better aligns with what other cemeteries are doing. And we did decide to differentiate between a traditional burial, which of course takes extra equipment and extra time for our staff, versus an interment, an entombment, or cremains burial, which takes significantly less time for us to manage. So those are reductions there. Again, primary increases were to the purchases of plots, graves, or niches within our columbariums. And again, we're very low actually from a rate comparison to other municipal cemeteries, and so we're trying to boost those up. However, we have taken a little bit different approach. It's becoming more common in the industry, although less common yet in our region, to tier plots based on their attractiveness or how desirable they are as far as their location. And so for traditional plots, oftentimes people want plots closest to the roadways within the cemetery. And sometimes that means that fill out towards the perimeter of the cemetery. Those plots get filled later, which means that you're driving over oftentimes plots with remains in them in order to get to empty plots to bury people. So operationally, it's better if we can work out and come in. And so the tiered structure kind of encourages people who care about the pricing or need to consider the pricing more to purchase some of those plots on the exterior so that we're filling in a way that makes sense operationally.
Bruce, did you want to ask a question real quick?
I did. You have your people here, right?
Absolutely.
Because I know you're new to this post, fairly new. But I haven't looked at 23's projections yet, but in the beginning of your presentation, you talked about saving money, trying to scale back. And I look at the baseline you gave us in 2018. When you go to 19, your expenses increased $5,000. Then when you go to 20, just from 19, you increased $17,000. And now in 22, you increased $110,000, which is 1,000% higher than anything you've done before. So I'm curious where you're going in 23, and if you're making these cuts you're talking about, how did we have such just an astronomical jump? It's huge. And so I guess I'm curious where it's coming from and what 23 is going to look like. If we're truly trying to cut back, how are we getting such a huge jump?
Mayor, council member, thank you for that question. And I asked the exact same question because I am new, and so when I saw this, I said, wait a minute,
Right.
explain this to me. So I do have those answers for you.
Perfect.
So between FY21 and FY22, we implemented the Graves compensation study. And so that boosted our non-full-time budget by $20,000 because those seasonal employees were getting paid significantly higher under the new compensation plan. which is good for hiring, not so good for your bottom line.
Right.
So then we also had a $65,000 increase in our watering expenses. Now you recall in fiscal year 21, we were mid-COVID, and operations were asked to pare back as much as possible because we didn't know financially what COVID would look like for us. And so we significantly reduced watering to the health and appearance of our turf. And so, and then in 2022, we had water restrictions, which also significantly reduced watering several months out of last season. And so those watering costs were artificially lower than they should be in order to maintain healthy turf for that facility. So this budget in FY22 reflected that increase back to what, you know, good watering would result in, which was a $65,000 increase. That being said, those were predictions based on what we needed for healthy turf. And at the end of FY22, we're seeing that we probably overestimated a little bit, so we're actually paring that back a little bit for FY23 to the tune of about $20,000. So you see a reduction there. To answer your original question, our budget from FY22 to FY23 is only seeing a $2,700 increase in operational expenses, and that's after a $26,000 bump in personnel expenses because of the personnel adjustments.
But your overestimation on the watering ended up saving you.
Correct.
Perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Great.
Any other questions?
Any other questions, Sophie? Yeah, Steve.
I know you said it was to accommodate or to be in the range, I'm talking about the weekend and holidays. Basically, what you're telling me is I'm better off and everybody ought to be trying to be buried on the weekend because it's half the price of being buried during the week.
Mayor, Councilman, that's a great point of clarity that we need to make. So this fee is in addition to the normal burial fee. So this is
Okay.
a surcharge that is
So
added.
basically, it's gonna be $12.50 then?
Correct.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
very good.
Yes, sir.
Because I was trying to figure out how we were, it just wasn't making
Right.
sense.
It's an additional fee
Okay.
on top of the normal burial fee. So great point.
Then we need to put a surcharge then by those, because by looking at that chart, I thought that was all it was gonna cost me on the weekend, and I'm trying to figure out the $850 versus the $400. I'm going, I'm gonna write that into my will, bury me on the weekend.
That's a great point. We will definitely make that one.
Lisa.
So for these prices, how do they align with Memorial Gardens? Because I think specifically we need to have the prices more aligned with that cemetery more than anything else.
Mayor, council member, actually, if it's okay, I would defer to Mike because I have not done comparisons and I don't know what Memorial Gardens charges.
Memorial Gardens is significantly under us. I mean, they don't charge enough, and it shows. They don't maintain their facilities very well at all.
And I can say that we've gotten that feedback, that their grounds are not manicured as nicely or maintained as nicely as
No,
ours.
they're not.
Bruce.
Just one question on the graves. We as a council approved that for the police department, if I remember correctly, when we gave those raises. Are we not involved in that? They can just do that on their own without council involvement when it comes to stipending their employees and taking money out of the general fund?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we try to bring salary and benefit recommendations every time you pass a budget. And so we will be spending quite a bit of time next Tuesday talking about employee raises that we're proposing, COLAs and those kinds of things, wherein if you decide not to do anything, Zulima's budget's going to look even better because a lot of those increases affect a small budget like this pretty dramatically.
But you've already instituted that, right? Have you not? They haven't yet?
Go ahead. Mr. Mayor, Councilman, every step that we've taken with regard to implementation of the grave study has been brought forward to this group. And so any changes that you're seeing with respect to FY22 and potentially FY23 will be steps that you have approved, that you've given us blessing for, and or potentially giving us blessing for moving forward.
Understood.
Anything else? Yeah, Kyle.
Thanks. This is more just to satiate my curiosity. I'm curious, the cemetery, how many plots do we have left? What is, do we have any idea what an expected timeline is for if we'd have to add on to the cemetery or build an additional one?
We just finished phase 3 in 2020, and so we should be good for another 15 to 17 years.
Thank you. And phase 3, what was the cost of that, if you don't mind my asking?
I am not 100% sure on that. I don't know any cost figures.
Thank you.
We can get that information too.
Thank you. Yeah, just throw me in the trash.
Lisa.
How many
cheaper.
phases are there?
Well, we still have 2 more, and that if we're allowed to expand, and that would be over west of the campus, Life Steps campus.
Any other comments, questions? Okay. That's Lena.
So additional things related to our plots and grades and niches that I did want to point out. I already talked about the tiered approach for those plots or grounds that are a little bit less desirable. Some questions that I've gotten asked that you may be wondering is, what does indigent mean? And that those are people who don't have family to claim them, and so there's no family that's responsible to pay for their services. And generally that is on the funeral home to cover those expenses. Perpetual care fees is another thing that I wanted to touch base on. So perpetual care is what we call the maintenance of the plot forever. So it's the irrigation and mowing that happens on that plot. Also collecting any memorial materials that were left, flowers or whatever that have now died or need to be removed. So it's that general maintenance of the plot. Traditional or the standard now in the industry is that you pay a perpetual care fee when you purchase your plot, and so that's covered in the cost, and that is how it is here in Casper as well. However, we didn't implement that perpetual care fee until 2012. So any plot that was purchased prior to 2012 did not consider the cost of maintenance forever, and so we do now apply these fees, if you approve, to those plots at the time that either the plot is transferred to another party who wants to buy or own it, or whether there's a monument set on the plot or somebody is buried in the plot. So as soon as somebody touches it and we know that they intend to utilize it, then we assess the fee that will cover the maintenance costs for life.
Hold on one second. Go ahead, Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks to Lima. I was actually really intrigued by that because I hadn't, I didn't know that was a thing. My question, as far as the perpetual care goes, are those fees put into a fund, the interest of which is used for that care and maintenance, or could you explain a little bit more about how that works? If it's a one-time deposit that simply gets absorbed in the budget and we just kind of plan for it in the future, or is it all put aside into a fund that goes towards the maintenance of the grounds?
Mayor, council member, if it is okay with you and Carter, I might defer to Jill on how that works because I'm not entirely sure. Because the cemetery is part of the general fund, I'm not sure how that revenue is handled exactly.
You're kind of putting me on the
Sorry.
spot, don't you know? I don't know exactly how that is handled, so if you don't mind, if I could do the research on that, and I can certainly let you know.
Sure.
Thank you.
Carter.
Mr. Mayor, Council, I would propose to you that would be the end result that we should probably pursue. I like that question because you are coming from a discussion about the larger perpetual care fund that we have been able to accomplish that. So I would suggest that would be something we should consider with those fees, but I would venture to say that we probably do not, and I suspect that's what Jill will find when she looks further into that. But it is what we should be doing with those fees, in my opinion.
Should be doing as in putting in an interest-bearing account or,
Right,
gotcha.
right.
Numbers, you have something?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right. Go ahead, Zolima.
Really, I think that covers it. But I had some questions myself about or the raised marker fee versus, or an oversized raised marker versus an undersized raised marker. Interestingly enough, that's based on the height, and it's because of irrigation obstruction. So the higher the monument, the more you can irrigate behind it, and that causes maintenance challenges for the turf. So then we have hand watering expenses, and so again, to incent smaller monuments that don't cause us that challenge, we reduce the price there. And let's see, really minimal changes for any disinterment or reinterment. Really the only adjustment there is for cremains. So this is when your cremated remains are actually buried. So again, just a slight adjustment to get a little bit closer. However, thankfully in our cemetery we don't see that request very often, and so it's okay to keep the prices low because we don't intend to generate a lot of revenue from that service.
No, yeah.
I think that's all for me. I'm
Awesome.
open to any other questions that you
Any
have.
other, sorry, any other questions for Zulima?
So I guess I would point out, if you scroll to the very bottom, our estimate for all of the rate increases per year, somewhere around $30,000 to $31,000, which would put us at that 46% recovery for FY23 if that were implemented, because our estimated expenses are right around $500,000.
Lisa.
I do have one question. Since we're doing all the parks for the watering, are we doing the same thing for the cemetery?
So that's an excellent question. Thank you, Mayor, Council Member. So Highland Cemetery actually has very little sprinklered irrigation. It's still a lot of manual hose pulling with manual sprinklers. We currently just executed a contract to have a portion of the park done, or a portion of the cemetery done with automated sprinkler system. But after that project is complete, it will only be at about 30% of the cemetery on automated sprinklers. So certainly we will continue to work towards automating the entire cemetery grounds on a sprinkler system, and then introducing that controller, the remote controller system, so that the moisture sensors can help us to be as efficient as we can with watering. Hand watering is very inefficient.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Mike needs something to do, don't you?
Thank you, Zulima. Anything else for Zulima? Okay, any discussion? Anybody want to talk about this or anything like that? Okay, so Carter, you just need us to give move forward with this. Obviously, will we talk about this in budget at all, or no?
Well, if council is, provisionally comfortable with the approach, we would take your direction from here and prepare for a formal consideration. This is a resolution, so it wouldn't be, yeah, that's right. So it wouldn't be an ordinance, 3 reading process, but we do need to get at least a resolution passed so that we can move forward with these changes.
Yeah, Bruce.
Well, to me, it seems more important that we get through the budget part of it first before we just rubber stamp it and throw out Graves money and everything else. I mean, this is all budget stuff, and I don't know how we could possibly say, yeah, go ahead, and the cemetery gets a raise, and then we get into the budget and nobody else gets one. That's going to cause huge dissension amongst our ranks. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm not in any position to say yes on this until we get into the budget and find out where we're at and what we're going to do for everybody else, in fairness.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I can appreciate where you're coming from. Be aware that by virtue of your potentially passing rate increases, you're not necessarily approving cemetery's budget. You are simply giving us the opportunity to adjust our rates in conformity with market. Rates meaning what we charge for plot purchases, what we charge for burials, and those kinds of things. The budget will not be addressed until you meet next Tuesday, and then of course subsequently for a formal reading the third Tuesday in June. So I would not take your direction with rates to say, hey, we're passing, everything else for the expense side of the cemetery's budget.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Actually, we're adjusting the revenue side.
Correct.
And that's it.
Right,
Yes, and that's
so
it.
with that clarity, then I'm all on board, thank you.
Great.
Is everybody okay with moving forward with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
One of the few things we can adjust on revenue side.
1 cent
That's
survey
right.
results.
That's right.
All right. Quick.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, thank you. We are at the point in time where we're just about done with the current 4 years of the current installment of 1 cent 16. And accordingly, we are gearing up for the potential passage of 1 cent 17, which is essentially a renewal, if you will, of the current 1 cent 5 cent installment of tax revenue into the portfolio of the general fund. And as you know, a big part of what we do in preparation for this potential renewal is we try to understand what it is the direction of the community would be with regard to the way in which the city spends the next installment if it should pass, which again is a 4-year proposal that you would be essentially considering, which for this council is a very important discussion to have, because again you're setting that path for the next 4 years if this should be renewed. A big part of our information gathering process is the survey process that we go through. That survey process is aided by a professional outfit that we hire to collect this data, to gather this data, help us even organize the survey instrument that we send out to the community. The community of which includes a county-wide cross-cut of registered voters here in the Toronto County. A number of the questions that we ask are certainly along the lines of sort of a polling standpoint, which is, do you feel comfortable that if it were to happen today, you would or would not support the renewal of the 1 cent again for another 4 years. We also try to ascertain what it is that the community's priorities are pertaining to the way in which the dollars would ostensibly be spent. Mr. Myers has been working really hard to gather that data in concert with ETC, which is a professional organization that does these kinds of things all over the country, as well as worked in concert with Fleur in her office to sort of lay out the strategy by which we would work on getting your formal direction in the form of a resolution. The second phase, if you will, of which we will be talking in much greater detail in future work sessions. So tonight we want to take the time to give you a feel for what the survey results are, what we believe the direction of the larger community is pertaining to a potential renewal, and entertain any questions or direction that you would have with regard to this important preparation phase. And so if I could turn some time over to Pete to walk us through that, I'd deeply appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Let's see, could we, thank you. So, Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Manager. Thanks, everybody. Oh, thanks. So yeah, we did the survey, and we actually did very well this year. In past years, we've struggled to get enough results. This was not the case this year. ETC Institute is the company that we've used for many, many years to do this survey, and so it's very nice to have the consistency. This year, they got a much better than average response rate. We got 704 out of all the people we asked for. That means that we had a slightly smaller error ratio, so we can rely on the results a bit more. It came to like plus or minus 3.7%, which for those of you who did really well in statistics, not me, then you'd feel very, very satisfied by that. Beyond that, yes, it was from registered voters from across the county. Obviously, once it is voted on by the entire county, not by municipality by municipality, so we definitely wanted the input of the entire county. Beyond that, we also asked people to give them a little bit of identifying information, basically their age, their family, their income, and so on and so forth, and also a sense for where they lived within the county, as a way to sort of try to parse the results a little bit based on these other factors to try to get a better sense for what they actually meant by all that. So when I talk about the regions of the county, this is what I'm talking about. Sherman County is roughly 80,000 people. We broke into 10,000 person areas. So each of the wards is about 20,000 people, so we split every ward in half, the north or the south, or in the case of Ward 2, east or west, just because Ward 2 naturally lends itself to that kind of a geography. We also merged Mills, Evansville, and Barnon into one group, so we could pull all that data together. And then last but not least, everything else was another 10,000 people or so. So again, so we divided everybody up into about 8 different groups. And the idea that that's another way to split things up and get a better sense of, well, this group said this and this other group said that. Again, going back to those who are really, really good at statistics, you will notice that by splitting it up that way, it does increase the error ratio. So although I do try to get a sense for what those subgroups said, I'm certainly not split it up too many times after that. Because if you start saying, well, look, I can split it up between men versus women, or I can split it by young versus old, or region 1 versus region 2, I can still get a sense for what that means. But if I start splitting it up even further, young versus old in this area, young versus old in this area, men versus women, then you start to get down to just a very few responses. It starts to be kind of nonsense data. So anyway, first of all, what exactly did they say about the 1 cent itself? If the election were held today, are you likely to support the 1 cent? Most people said yes. 1 cent seems to have a very good, solid reputation in Toronto County. This is pretty consistent, and it holds up. And so we've asked that question a number of times over the last couple of years. There's a preceding question of like, the 1 cent has been in place for X number of years. You know, if the election were held today, would you be likely to vote in favor of the 1 cent? For several of these, I'm going to take this number here. It's very likely and somewhat likely to add it together to 76 in this particular case. So you'll see here, we've asked this exact same question for more than a decade now. 2010, 2014, 2018, 2021, now 2022, and this overall support, you can see it fluctuates a bit, but it's pretty strong throughout, and it holds pretty well. How well does this actually work as far as predicting what the election actually turns out? Well, pretty well, actually. If you take these two numbers together, you get that number, which is the one I was pointing out before, it correlates pretty darn well with how it votes in the end. Now, I don't want to read too much into that. First of all, you never want to just sort of assume it's a done deal, because it's not. Certainly, November is 6 months away. Beyond that, you've got an entire educational campaign. You can't you can't assume that the individuals who felt very likely today are still the individuals who feel likely 6 months from now. Some of those people are going to change their mind. Or some of these people who are not likely today might be likely in 6 months. Again, so you got to take the data for what it really is, but I am going to point out that there's a pretty good correlation between the sum of those numbers and what actually turns out 6 months later. Similar thing, we did another one in 6 cents last year. A little less of a happy story here. We got these two numbers add up to 45%, basically saying not positive support for implementing the 6 cent, and that's kind of what happened. So again, you can see the predictive value here of the survey versus what actually turns out. So I can go back further if you want, but I didn't want to tell the same story 12 times. But you look back at 2014 to 2010, the results are pretty similar, with a few percentage variations between that and that. From there, I guess one other thing I want to point out about this. You'll see that there's another question in the survey about, has the 1 cent been good for Detroit County? And you'll see that one was overwhelmingly yes. It was 91% of the people who responded saying yes, the 1 cent is good for Detroit County. But it doesn't necessarily line up with, would you vote for the 1 cent if it was held today? I think that's interesting. I'm not exactly sure what it means, but it certainly suggests to me that people feel like it's been good in the past, but they're still not quite sure they want to continue it. But again, it's hard to interpret exactly how those two things square together.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Thanks, Mayor. While you had this graphic pulled up, it's been a while since I took my research and stats class, so I'm sure there's probably a rationale for it, but I was curious. It's good to hear. I was going to ask you, as far as the survey results, how they track to actual election results, so thank you for going over that. It looks like it tracks pretty well on the support side of things. On the non-supportive side of things, that's where I'm more curious. The spectrum of answers you have is very likely, somewhat likely, not sure, not likely. Very likely and somewhat likely are both positive and support. There's 2 of them on one side. On the other side, there's only 1, not likely. It seems a bit weighted towards positive responses, and so I'm just curious if the rationale why it was laid out that way, why there's not maybe 5 options, very somewhat likely, very somewhat unlikely, and then not sure right in the middle. Do you have any enlightenment on that? Thank you.
I don't have, Mr. Mayor, I don't have a whole lot of insight into that. I've been a city employee now for a year or 2, a couple decades, but the survey predates me. The way we structured that question, it's been around, and it's been asked very, very similarly all these times. So the best I can say is, well, that's how we've always done it, and it kind of works. But I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer. But
you're right, and thank you. The only reason there's multiple reasons why I was asking, I guess, but it was curious to me because the not sure, at least for me personally, isn't super valuable, because when you go to vote, it's either yes or no, and so, or you don't go, so yeah, it looks like the positive results track well with the election results, so I'm happy to see that. On the negative side of things, it looks like we're underestimating or minimizing the lack of support in the survey compared to the actual election results, which is true.
No, and that's valid. I guess I would point out that when it comes to survey doctrine, there's a lot of discussion about, do you provide an option to say, I don't know? You can certainly anytime you ask a survey question, there's certainly going to be some people who say, I don't know, even if you don't ask them or don't present that as an option. But when you present it as an option, it tends to increase that slice of the pie. So yes, I think that being consistent on that particular point is helpful. But yes, as far as the thinking of like, is there not likely versus a absolutely not or a hell no or something. No, this is the way it's always been done. So,
thank you.
Go ahead, Bruce.
On the same token, I didn't see a spot when I went through it that shows where all that money's gone and the things that it's actually been spent on. So if I get a survey in the mail, I don't want somebody asking me, would you likely vote for it again? Because if you look at the negative responses we got, they're all over the board. And a lot of them are David Street Station, and that was privately funded. So I guess my question, or what I would like to see personally, is if you send me a survey, I want to know where that money's been spent. And if you can show me all the good that the 1 cent money's doing, I'm going to be more likely to get behind it and want to do that. It's just a thought. I'm just going to say, while I have the floor for a second, we had an email from a constituent who wanted to know why we only polled the voters, and I'm like, well, why would we poll non-voters? And if we're gonna do that, why don't we send one out to everybody that comes and visits our town, because they're pumping this 1 cent every time they come into our town. So I said, your question doesn't really hold any weight, and then of course he went down another rabbit hole that I did not chase him in, but I just thought that it should be mentioned that this is, the voters are the ones that decide, so why would we survey anyone else?
Kyle?
Thank you, Mayor. To add on to that point that Councilman Nell just made, onecentprocess.com is the site that shows where those allocations have been made in the past. I was just looking at it today, which is the only reason I know it off the top of my head. But yeah, so onecentprocess.com, you can see this cycle that we're in, 16, where all of that funding was allocated towards. To your point, though, I do think it would be helpful, whether it's a paper survey or digital, to link to that resource so that people can see. I think that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at the allocations from 16, you know, the comments we got, like you said, all over the place, mentioning things that didn't even weren't even attached to 1 cent funding. When you look at the list, it's a pretty good list of, you know, it's hard to look at any of those and say that's an egregious waste of money. I mean, they're all, you know, good things. I guess we could disagree on priorities, but there is a misunderstanding, I think, in the community of where 1 cent funding has gone historically.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mayor. And I guess just to respond to a couple of those comments, thank you for bringing that up. And certainly, we do get a lot of people who, we used to do surveys. We did a survey several times, which would ask sort of, how is the city doing on various kinds of services? And that doesn't really apply here so much, but it used to always be the case that whenever we asked how the city's doing on various kinds of services, we always got extremely low marks on public information. Where we would ask, because we would hit the citizen with 50 questions, how do you like the watering at the cemetery, or how do you like your treatment of the police department, how do you like this, that, and the other, so on and so forth. And then at the end we would say, well, how are we doing as far as communication? And we always got very low marks. And I guess one interpretation of that result was always that, well, we just hit you with a whole bunch of questions that you didn't know the answers to because you haven't interacted with those services. So now you're feeling like really the city ought to interact, tell you much more about what's going on. And I do think that citizens who respond to this kind of survey do get kind of flat-footed. The more questions we ask of them, the more they become aware of what they don't know. And then they start to feel, like, yeah, I'd like to know more. And I guess the other point I would like to make is that certainly we've always tried to do this in a two-part version, where we do this collection of data before the public education aspect really gets going, with the idea of being like, this is where people are today, this is where they are in a natural state, so to speak, before there's an effort to educate.
Set the baseline.
Precisely.
Sure.
And certainly there's going to be, as people get more information, they start to make up their minds in different ways, and also hopefully try to clear up any myths and errors that people are making. And certainly that's always an uphill battle, but that is always the goal, to get a sense for where they are right now today, and then build from there to help, especially to clear up those myths and inaccuracies that are out there. So, okay.
That's good.
Okay, I was going to go here.
Sean made me hungry.
All right, let's talk about the priorities. So you may have, this chart was in your memo and in the packet. This is probably the centerpiece as far as the results for the 1 cent survey. It gives us a sense for how the citizens feel as far as prioritizing different kinds of investment opportunity within where the 1 cent money could be going. And of course, we ask them very important, somewhat not. This, to a certain extent, I'm not going to say it speaks for itself, but it kind of speaks for itself, where its priorities are. I would point out that over the years there, again, because we've got multiple years of asking this or similar question, these four tend to hang out near the top. They will sometimes switch around, moving one to the other or something like that. But these four tend to be rotating among at the top of the level, with more fluctuation down here among other kinds of services. And I'll try to deal with a couple of these more specifically as we go, but just as a general sense, these tend to be pretty stable, and these maybe fluctuate a bit more. So I'll just walk through some of these real quickly as far as
You
what I was-
surveyed Kyle, didn't you?
I love.
Kyle answered 300 times.
In answer to your question, I have no idea.
I want the streets.
They're all enough.
Sure, but no, just as a side note, yeah, the survey results are anonymous. I can't, although we do get more data than just as appears in the report, we don't get names. We don't know who responded or what they said. Just okay, I know you didn't really think that I was talking about this, but I did want to point that out, and I'll take the segue.
But seriously, I put it at the top.
For those people who did respond to the survey, these are kind of what we found. As I mentioned, I did slice and dice the results in some ways based on age, location, and so on. Street repair, very, very, very consistent. Everybody wants to spend a lot of money on streets. Didn't much matter where you lived or who you were. Everybody thought that's a really good idea. Let's spend some money on streets. Water and sewer projects, again, not a whole lot of diversity, which I thought was interesting, even with the other areas outside of Turner County. There was slightly less support in those more rural areas, and I have to assume at least some of that is because many of those people don't have water service and or sewer service at their homes. But even then, it was still rather strong. Fire and EMS service, some variation based on age. Seemed to be valued more by our older citizens than our younger. And some bit of value more for women than for men. Drainage and flood prevention. This one stood out for me because I mentioned that there was some amount of movement. Drain and flood prevention increased a lot this time through, and I don't really know why. But it was much more higher priority than in previous iterations of the survey. Let's see, again, slightly more important for the elder citizens and slightly more preferred by women and men. Police, again, slightly more preferred by older citizens than younger citizens. And again, slightly more preferred by women than men. Now we're moving down, and by the way, I do want to point out, I have this number up here, I forgot to mention this. This is some of the very important and important number. So even within that, there has to be some amount of fluctuation as far as the very important versus the important. But it's a good headline number to just bring things going. Anyway, moving on. Parks and playgrounds. The under 44 set liked it much more than the older people. It's, again, it's not hard to try to come up with a story to support that. Some sense that younger people, especially younger people with children, might be using the parks and thinking about them more often, as opposed to people who might be empty nesters or older people. I don't know that for certain, but again, you have this data, and you don't never have everything you want to know, but at least you can try to apply a story to the numbers you've got and try to make it make sense. Cybersecurity. Older groups thought this was more important than younger groups. Also, this is another one that jumped a lot. It was very near the bottom of the survey this last time around, and now it's in the middle, it was 7. So again, this seems to be of rising importance. River restoration, very little variation by age group, but a bit more variation by where you lived. Ward 3, North Ward 1 and South Ward 3 were very in favor. Others, again, a little bit less. But again, public buildings, strongest in Mills and Lexington, and are not. Especially among the very important. There are a certain number of people who really support this. Maintenance savings account, we call it maintenance savings account, but effectively it's a proxy for perpetual care. So pretty much everybody liked it about the same. Again, some variation by region. And again, it seemed to be popular among those Evansville by none, which of course is interesting because perpetual care tends to be a feature of the city of Casper. That's a lot of fun. But it seems like there's support for the idea outside of city of Casper as well, which is interesting. Community assistance, which is generally speaking is support for people who are needier individuals, low income, or people who are struggling. Some are more support amongst slightly older people, a bit more support for women than for men, less support for more to west. I wasn't quite sure about that, but that stood out. People in the western not supported so much. Bus services, a great deal of variation by age. Elder citizens strongly supported this, younger citizens not so much. Again, it's not hard to come up with a story for that. Certainly many of our older citizens rely on the link especially as a way to get to where they need to go. Sports and physical fitness, of course, these are now near the lower end of the support level. Still valued a bit more by younger people than by the elder. And a bit of variation by where you lived. I was a little surprised by that as well. Last but not least, culture and entertainment. Women tend to think it was more valuable than men, and younger people tend to think it was more valuable. It was more discarded by the elders, but more valued by the younger. And again, you can try to apply stories to what that means. But again, surveys, they help with that, but they don't actually solve it for you. They give you some amount of information, but in the end, you have to intuit a bit more to really understand what's going on. Beyond that, we also ask people the same question but in a different way. We asked, if you got $100 and you were to split it up yourself, where should that $100 go? How would you divide it up among these 5 categories? Now, we didn't ask all 13 categories from the earlier area, mostly because we thought that'd be too much cognitive burden to try to break it down. It's like, well, 5 cents for this and 2 cents for that, and so on. So it's just 5, so it's a little bit broad. But you can see, I suppose, when I look at this data, what I see is that although buildings and public safety were dominant, and that reflects back to what we saw earlier, it wasn't so dominant that it sort of crowds out these other 3 areas. There's still support for that. People have $100. They still want to give some funding to these other areas as well, even though these areas are larger. Again, by roughly a 2 to 3 ratio. So there is a base of support, even if generalized the community thinks these are more important. They still want to spread the money around. That's what I see when I look at this. That's more or less my conclusion as far as the survey results. Now, we did have other questions on the survey, and I'm happy to dive into those as well if you guys would like. For example, we did ask priorities among the county. There's about county residents or how the county commissioners should be splitting up their money. That question is more obviously for the county commissioners' benefit, but certainly we can talk about that one as well if you'd like. And then there was other discussion about making what's permanent. We'll talk about that as well. But generally speaking, at this point, we've got the data. We've got a sense for how the community is feeling about this. For now, it's a question of what do you do next? And so we've got this process sketched out that we'd like your blessing on. Certainly, we've got the results 2 weeks ago. I did what I could with it between now and May 24th, which is today. The vision now is that staff will try to apply these numbers into an actual 4-year budget. That's not an easy thing to do, but we'll try to sort of make the two reflect as best we can and then present it back to you at the end of June. From there, there's always a certain amount of money, or I should say, traditionally there's a certain amount of money set aside for community projects, which is support for nonprofit agencies around town. And of course, how much that is fluctuates from 1 cent to 1 cent, but traditionally there is a certain amount set aside for that subset. And the idea would be to have an application process so that those organizations can come forward and request support from you all. And that will happen through the end of summer, with the conclusion being a resolution, again, passed by council. If that is the council's desire to do that again, presumably in the middle of August. So that's
great. Open it up for questions. Amber.
I have 2. First, can I get this deck? A copy of the deck?
the deck.
Probably.
Yes, absolutely.
Second, so, in your analysis, there was a trend of women supporting these things more enthusiastically than men in the individual sort of segments of where money could be spent. I didn't see any that indicated that. Thank you.
Bless
Any
you.
that indicated that men supported more than women. Does that also
Damn it.
track
Excuse me.
into
Bless you.
Thank you.
the overall likeliness to support the initiative on the ballot? Were there more men who said no, or were there just more men that they're like, yes, I would support it, but I'm not that enthusiastic about any of these things?
I don't remember.
Okay, that's fine.
Well, yes.
Maybe women just answer the surveys more.
Well, it was 50-50 on the respondents, so.
There's nothing to ask me. My opinion is to save money is, why do they have so many new police officer cars and pickups? I think that's a big expense that is unnecessary. We don't need a new vehicle every week or every year. I know it's an exaggeration, but really, when you think about it, do they really need that?
I'll talk to you after the meeting about that.
I mean, you could go 2 years on a pickup and 2 things. That would save a lot of money.
So if I may,
Yeah.
in answer to your question, not a whole lot of difference.
Okay.
Some preference or some bit more support for women over men as far as overall
Mhm.
support for the one side.
Generally similar.
But pretty close.
Interesting.
So yeah.
So they just were more likely to say like, I guess I'll vote for it, but
But
These
the
are
level-
only
the
sort
level
of,
of
yeah,
enthusiasm.
only sort of important.
What was necessary.
Okay, cool.
So I'm sorry, this is for anybody who wants to geek out with me, we can go through this.
Set aside some time though.
When he geeks hard, is that what you're saying?
Cool, that's all I had for my questions.
Okay, great. Other questions? Kyle?
Thank you. I don't know who's best suited to answer this question, maybe you, Pete. Could you speak, as far as the community projects portion of the 1 cent funding, could you speak to when the city started allocating money for those purposes? I know when 1 cent started, it was originally for City Hall, Fire Station 1, and something else. But I imagine that was added at some point after the initial 1 cent. Didn't know if you knew the history.
I'm afraid I don't know the history well enough. I know it's been quite some time. Yeah, I'm sorry, I just.
Okay, no worries. It's kind of a obscure question. So.
But I do have the resolutions back to 171 if you need to look at them, so you can just see the laws out there.
Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
Councilman, I can tell you we've had that happening for a long time. At least the previous 16, 15, and 14, I would say, are probably helpful in investing in community projects. To give you a frame of reference as well, for this current cycle, 16, we spend $2 million a year on community-based projects. And would that include Trails Trust, Boys and Girls Club?
Is that the nonprofit money you're talking about?
Basically.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that's basically that.
Mercer Family Resource Center gets
Right.
funding.
Yep. Yep, there's a number of them, yeah. And there's a number of them that you've turned down too in the application process as well, so. Anyway.
Thank you.
Other questions for Pete? Yeah.
I just have one. With this, if the new 1 cent gets approved, we will have an entirely new agenda of where that money is going. It won't be status quo as it has been, right? In other words, we can really get some streets fixed around here. We can really delve into a lot of that kind of stuff, right?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that's exactly right, and that's why you're in such an important position right now in this period of history, if you will, because you do get to set the agenda for the next 4 years. And the resolution that you pass is essentially the contract with the community, as it were, in terms of, you know, the category of how you're going to spend it. So, for example, if you look at the survey results that we've gotten back here and you're like, okay, 90% of the respondents say that streets are the most important, you get to set aside proportionately the highest priority of these funds dedicated to streets. As one example, of course, but if you, for example, are saying, well, $2 million is either not enough or too much, you get to set that course too for community project investment and so on, community service investment and so on. So yeah, you really are in a very important role, because that resolution you pass serves as our direction for the next 4 years.
Perfect.
Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor. And I guess to add on to Councilman Nell's question, thank you, Carter, for the context. I personally, everyone knows, love streets. I loved the survey results, just reaffirming my belief that that's what everyone's talking about and that's what interests them, until we get up to at least the $7 to $8 million where we're just maintaining the streets. It's going to be really hard to push me off of, you know, I just think that's where our priority should be, at least until we get to that 7 to 8 million. So I guess you know where I stand when we go into those conversations. It's going to be really hard to push me off this warpath I'm on to get our streets budget up to what I feel is an appropriate level.
I don't think you'll get pushed off. The public's saying that's what they want, so I think you're right in line.
I think the conversation too is, I know because I've been a part of two, I've been a part of one or two, I can't remember, probably two now. I think the conversation certainly varies from year to year, and I think the conversation, while we can certainly look at, and based upon that, the survey results certainly help us. I think it's going to be good to have an objective view of everything in there and have that conversation. And so what I would suggest too is that hopefully everybody has kind of an open mind of how we try to do those things. Certainly 91% is very, very vocal to say streets, which should be a major priority for us. And so it'll be a good conversation, and it's kind of an opportunity, like Carter just said, an opportunity to create and set the agenda with this fantastic blessing, being able to do this 1 cent funding to help our community and streets. I 100% agree. So it'd be great. Amber.
What does the process look like in terms of when we're kind of dealing with the community projects side of it? Do we get, do we see some sort of like report from where the previous community projects before we have to make decisions on these community projects?
Yeah, they have to do and I know Fleur obviously knows the process a lot better than I do, but yeah, they do have to put in a whole application within that, showing why they're requesting it, what the funding goes to, administration could be that. So it's a pretty big process.
And does the report come from everyone or just people that are reapplying as part of their application?
Fleur.
Your Honor, we have reports from the previous year, so we get reports right now, and those are in the info packets, and so those you'll see the quarterly and annual reports. So we get those, and as we invoice, they have to turn those in to us. And so you get those right now, and then when they apply, they'll have to put in what they got last time as well. So,
okay.
But for everyone who's received it from this cycle, 16, you're getting those reports right now.
Okay.
Carter, yes, I'll get you.
To try to add some additional information to what potentially your question might be as well. Throughout the timeline process that you see there as a proposal, we're going to do our dead level best to try to bring you a list of projects from the city's perspective, obviously, as to what we think the community is prioritizing, the categories of projects that we're going to bring forward to you. Hopefully in that process as well, we will bring you a dollar figure that we would suggest might be appropriate for community service type investment over the next 4 years. Your job will certainly be that of seeing whether or not you agree with the way in which the staff is prioritized capital projects that we're bringing forward, but also whether or not you agree that that amount of community service type investment is appropriate. Given the needs that you will be very informed of by this point in time, and what you think the community is telling you as well. So it's a tricky balance to find, honestly. It's almost like putting together a Rubik's Cube, for those who know what that reference even is. It's a puzzle. How about that? It's a puzzle. we're trying to put together. But indeed, we've got a lot of projects that we hope to be able to get support from as it relates to this. And then you'll get to see also what the community wants in terms of outside investment is concerned.
Kyle, Amber had a follow-up.
I have a follow-up, yes. So, along those lines, I noticed several comments in there indicating that, folks think that the city of Casper, some folks think that the city of Casper has strayed from the original purpose of the tax, which was just for infrastructure, according to some people. When did we start funding community projects and that sort of thing relative to the inception of when we first passed the 1 cent?
Mr. Mayor, council member, I appreciate that question, but I think we're going to have to do a little more research to try to figure that out. As I sit here in front of you, back when the very first cycle that I went through, I would be willing to bet that we did some investment pursuant to a committee we had put together to help us facilitate all that information, a citizen committee. So that would have been, the year 2000 or earlier. But I'd probably feel better, though, if we could do a little more research in that regard to give you a real solid, definitive answer as to how long that type of investment's been in place.
Kyle, and then Bruce.
Thank you, Mayor. Kind of a follow-up to Councilwoman Pollock's question. I was trying to find it on the city's website. I read it earlier today. But it sounded like that the 1 cent, at least initially and historically, was geared more towards capital and infrastructure, not to be used for employee wages and stuff. And I guess that's kind of what I was getting at with my questions earlier is I believe we've gotten quarterly reports. I swear I've read reports from people that received 1 cent funding. And I remember on multiple occasions in those reports seeing that funding being used for employee wages and stuff like that. And so I guess that's, we'll have this discussion when if 1 cent passes and we discuss allocation at that time. But I personally would love to see it move back towards capital and infrastructure as opposed to us subsidizing employee wages for nonprofits that do great work in the community, but again, we can't even take care of our streets right now. So that's where I stand. Thanks.
I know one of the things too, kind of to that point, that for the 1 cent funding, really I know has been kind of a stay away from, as part of the city of Casper, trying to stay away from that aspect of it. That it really kind of steers clear to those areas that that the survey points out to, but plus also steering clear from that. But Carter and I were just talking a second ago. I know there are other municipalities within our area that do utilize that for that reason. Some of the smaller municipalities will utilize it for salaries and things like that. I know we've stayed away from it probably fairly consistently. Would you agree with that, Carter?
Absolutely. Yeah. Mr. Mayor, there's one narrow application that council's been willing to consider, and that's with respect to subsidizing the aquatics program so that our rates for people to get in and swim, basically, are low to zero. And so you have, expressly allowed 1 cent dollars to be infused into both the pools as well as with respect to transit. And it's for the exact same reason, so that barriers for service access are just about eliminated. And that's it. Really.
Bruce.
Well, and with that said, just following up Kyle and Amber, those are presented to the public.
Yep.
They know where this money's going. They know what we're doing with it.
Yep.
We're not hiding behind anything. We're very transparent. So when we say we're going to allocate X amount of, $2 million for nonprofits, then people understand where that money's going. So it's not like we're pulling the wool over anybody. But when you decide to come to us and say, we're going to use $2 or $3 million, whatever it is, to help fund our nonprofits, we also have an idea or a projection of what that 1 cent is going to bring us over the next 4 years, so that we know what piece of the pie we're giving up for those things also, correct?
Absolutely correct.
Okay, excellent.
Now, the thing that everybody needs to remember along those lines is we sign a contract with those nonprofits. And if we take a 20% hit on 1 cent funding because of recession, oil market bust, whatever, that all comes out of the city's portion. We are still obligated to the 1 cent to the nonprofits to live up to our contracts with them. So that 2 million, whatever we decide, will still have to come right off the top to the nonprofits.
Thanks, Mayor. Just in response to Councilman Cathy's comment, didn't the city, this was before some of our time on council, I thought we reduced 1 cent funding to nonprofits by 20% back in 2019 or something? Okay.
Well, as a follow-up, shouldn't
Some
there
of them
be?
were willing to do that, but some of them weren't. But contractual, and that was because they voluntarily were willing to do that. We actually had a signed contract with them that if they wanted to hold us to it, they could have.
Bruce.
Well, then maybe we need to revamp our contracts in the event something like that happens. The verbiage is in there to protect the city. I think that's more than appropriate, especially when it's a handout, if you will. So that's probably something we should look into doing. Just for the protection aspect, if anything.
Thank you for my segue into your comment.
Any other questions, comments about this process as we move forward? Do you need anything specifically from us, Trevor?
Mr. Mayor, I think if you're comfortable with what you see on the screen right now, and if you concur with the direction that we got from the surveys, we will use this as well as that general broad direction to try to put together a proposal for you to present on the 28th, and then you can determine the extent you want to move forward from there. And as far as community projects are concerned, whether or not you agree with our proposals, and so on. So that would be what I would ask. Thumbs up on that, and general concurrence with the survey results, if you will.
So is everybody good with the proposed schedule and then the survey results? All right.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. If anybody wants to make an appointment with Pete to go over those numbers.
They want to geek out, you mean? Isn't that what you called it, Pete? Geeking
How long should you put in the schedule for, Pete?
Well, depends on how many days you want to do it.
Oh,
jeez.
Oh. Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it. All right, agenda review. Mr. City Manager.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To your expectation, on the 31st, we are going to be going over the budget discussion, and that is, a period of time where we'll go into a lot of detail and talk about a lot of direction that you could potentially take or may want to take, and so on. It says 3.5 hours, and generally speaking, that's about what it is that we spend when it comes to that first work session. But what I wanted to remind you of is that if indeed you want more time or need more time, that is not meant to be the only night you have available for this purpose. And so we would certainly take that direction on the night of the 31st, and we could meet again the following Wednesday or other nights, whatever you'd prefer. I just didn't want you to think that we would be, closing the window in terms of what time we may need to talk about that further. The night of the 7th, a couple things we wanted to bring to your attention. We will be establishing the public hearing both for the formal budget hearing, which, as you know, happens on the 3rd Tuesday in June, but also for the budget amendment discussion, which, ostensibly wraps up fiscal year 22, if all goes well there. And so be mindful of those sorts of topics that will be coming forward to you here real soon. We also will be starting the reading process for the Parkway discussion, which has generated a lot of interest, which is a surprise to nobody, I'm sure. That first reading starts on the 7th. Let's see. As to another work session heads up, the 14th, which is on your next page, we have a few topics for consideration that we want you to be aware of. The Casper Business Center is included in that agenda so that we can talk to you about uses for that building, which will exceed the assumption that it would only be used for police services. We're anticipating kind of building the use of this building into that discussion as well, so be mindful of that. We'd like to talk to you about the budget amendment for fiscal year 22. That's what that budget amendment number 3 means, and give you some detail there. We also anticipate that the facility study will be back and ready for informal discussion that evening, and that's the analysis that takes place, or that we've been working on, I should say, that evaluates 120 buildings. Is that right? Or it sounds overwhelming.
It is overwhelming.
Yes, and probably not a small number at that. So, but a lot of good data, and I'm sure something you're going to want to evaluate as we talk about buildings moving into the summer.
Carter, do you mind my interrupting? Will the Fort Wyoming Center be a part of that, or is that separate?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, there will be elements of the Fort Wyoming Center included in that, but that will be strictly from a physical plant evaluation. Another study, however, is coming forward that evaluates the future application of the event center and, you know, what repurposing opportunities might exist. And I think that is scheduled for...
It was the next week.
28th.
I'm
yeah.
ahead of you, sorry.
That's okay, no problem. That'll be for the 28th. As far as the 28th is concerned, just like you saw on the screen here a few minutes ago, we'll be bringing back the 1 cent conversation. ICE expansion is actually a facility discussion as well that the users will want to visit with you about, the user groups will want to visit with you about. And then of course the North Platte River Park subdivision is actually a follow-up item to the land that's adjacent, with respect to the land that's adjacent to the Fort Wyoming Center. Directing your attention to the very back page, again you can kind of see the docketed items and topics for purposes of reminding you, as well as giving you the opportunity to add to this list if council so desires. And so with that, Mr. Mayor, that concludes my agenda review.
Great. Any questions for Carter on the agenda review? I will be out of town for work on the 28th, so I will be absent. So in my stead will be the vice mayor. So that'll be good.
Where are you going? No, I'm just kidding. I have a question.
So at our work sessions.
What time does the meeting start on the 28th?
On the 28th,
You
that'll
won't
be
here, but-
at 4:30.
Okay. I'll get the correct answer to that next.
All right, sounds good.
Yeah. I have other things.
Fair enough.
Anybody has any questions or thoughts, considerations? Oh, Steve. Sorry, I got thrown off just a smidge.
You gonna talk to her? Yeah, good, because I wanted to educate her too.
Thanks, Chief.
I was gonna ask Carter on the staff items, the shipping container ordinance update. When we had our meeting with the 6 cities we were talking about, that in particular, could we bring that up on a work session so we can have those discussions?
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, absolutely. If I remember correctly, there was a sort of an ancillary item we were going to bring with that too. Do you remember what that was, by chance?
I remember it again. That's what just triggered my memory.
I would recommend it for the summer, if that's okay. That works for everybody. We'll docket it accordingly, and if that ancillary item comes up.
Well, I got all summer to think about it.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Anything else about that? Did you have something about, was it liquor license?
Yeah, did you?
I was hoping I could bring that up in the next item, legislative review.
Perfect. So that you got that next. Okay, I don't think anybody else has anything, so we'll move forward to legislative review.
All right. Mr. Mayor, I do have a couple things for legislative review that I wanted to bring to council's attention and potentially get direction accordingly. we had the opportunity to visit with the Judicial Committee this past week in, actually yesterday in Lander. We sent a contingent up there to visit with those folks. And the topic that we wanted to touch base with them on was with regard to the vulnerable persons legislation that's being considered as an idea right now at the committee level. It does appear that that conversation is going to continue through the committee process into September, which I'm thankful to hear. And in that circumstance, the discussion about who all should be included in that, that crimes legislation, so far includes folks like healthcare workers and teachers and others that might be included escape me at this point in time, but at the very least, healthcare workers and education workers as well. So the good news is that has not been kicked out of committee at this point in time, and I would suggest it has some traction and very positive traction at that. So I certainly appreciate our team going up, and there were some other advocates there as well. I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. As to other items to bring up by way of just sort of status reports, if you will, as Vice Mayor Friel indicated, we had the opportunity to visit with a number of other cities this past week, last week that is, and one of the topics that came up for conversation was alcohol and some of the associated legislation. The 6 cities, as we call them, came up with a couple of ideas pursuant to some feedback from practitioners in the business, and they suggested a couple things and asked if indeed the city of Casper would be willing to amend the resolution that they submitted, that we submitted, that you all submitted to the resolutions committee at the WAM level, so that it would include an idea like this. The idea being that with respect to the likely pushback that full retail license holders would present if we were to try to mess around with what it is the legislation supports for license holders in that category, the proposal is that a tavern license be created that allows for people, business owners, potential business owners, to approach the city with whatever community that might mean in Wyoming, to have access to creating a bar-only kind of establishment. So the tavern license would not require a 60-40 food component. It would not allow for the creation of a package component so that, it would become a liquor store. Nor would it necessarily have the same obligations that a bar and grill would have either, and therefore really only be a provision that would allow for the creation of a bar, and only a bar. The suggestion is at this point in time, and of course this idea has a lot of journey to make here in terms of actually becoming law potentially. But the idea is that this would be a license that the city would issue, and therefore the city would be essentially selling. So the concept would be that it would not require a sale on the same level of a retail license, wherein the market at this point in time in Casper is anywhere between $250,000 to $300,000. But it wouldn't be as cheap, so to speak, as a bar and grill license or a new issue retail license, which, as you recall, is in the neighborhood of $1,500 to the sponsoring city. So the idea would suggest that a tavern license would actually be, more expensive. The proposal would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.50 per citizen. Obviously, depending on what size your city is, would drive the cost of that tavern license. so that there is a pay-to-play concept in mind, which would be less offensive, hopefully, to those who hold retail licenses and had to pay quite a bit to get into that business. But the same token would still allow for folks who want to get into the business at the bar and grill level and wouldn't have that same kind of investment, although they would still have to worry about menus and food service and those kinds of things. A bar and grill would, a tavern would not be a bar and grill. There would be no food expectation or requirement, but there would be the idea that there would have to be a pay-to-play component involved. We are hoping that a license of this nature would be unlimited and be allowed to basically have the local level legislators determine what's appropriate and as far as how many licenses to administer and give out each year. The other idea that came up was with respect to the bar and grill component. Indeed, the suggestion that the 6 cities really liked and would hope that the legislature would feel similarly is indeed to make the bar and grill licenses unlimited in terms of how many a city council can administer. So, for example, tonight, where you have provisionally awarded a bar and grill license to Mr. Childs and La Cocina, you could have any number of conversations along those lines with folks who are willing to take on that type of a business were this type of change to be supported at the legislative level. The only other aspect of discussion that took place, and the leadership was there with me in that meeting to help capture some of these details, was with respect to the retail license side of things. Undoubtedly, the city of Casper, for example, will eventually get a new retail license to be issued by the state and therefore potentially issued by the city council here in Casper. You know that in the past, those licenses have been sold to the community, so to speak, for $1,500. The proposal at this point in time, if of course you guys agree, and obviously if the legislature would support it, would be that these new issue licenses into the future would command more than a $1,500 fee. That would be subject to local authority to determine how much it should be. It could be based on market, it could be based on bids, it could be based on bids with a floor that looks like what market requires. But the bottom line is the city would get paid and not,
Not an immediate windfall.
Right, exactly. Not an immediate windfall to those who receive that license. Obviously, these are just ideas. My request to you would be to consider what I've just shared with you and consider an amendment that might capture some or all of these ideas so that we could take this forward to the resolutions committee and see what kind of traction we could get with, again, some or all of these concepts.
Bruce, go ahead.
The tavern thing sounds like a good idea. I'm opposed to charging more than $1,500 for a license. Government's greedy enough. We don't, everybody else got it for $1,500. Why do we need to get $5,000? I don't want my name on that. People are taxed and paying money every time they turn around, and now we're going to jack a license price on them that everybody else got for $1,500. I'm not okay with it. Do I want to see unlimited bar and grill license? Absolutely. But should they have to pay any more than anybody else when they're going to have the expense of putting in a building or remodeling it or doing whatever? No, I don't like it.
Steve. Oh, sorry, Steve. This is Steve.
Is there anything that we could do right now? In the statutes, there is a limit to the number of catering permits you can get at a certain location. And so, can that be changed to where if you own both places, then you can have unlimited number of catering permits to those locations. Because we did have one place that was caught in that bind that, you know the one I'm talking about probably, but that is something that you're forcing then the owner of a retail license that owns this other establishment to turn around and go to a third retail licensee if they overbook occasions or venues at their venue, which that doesn't seem quite right either.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I assume you're asking that question pursuant to what statute currently requires. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, given some of the changes that have been made in the last couple of legislative sessions, it's a lot more convoluted, and so I'm going to have to defer to Fleur to kind of walk us through that, if that's okay, Fleur.
Yep, keep it up.
Your Honor, members of council, so yes, currently it's 36 catering permits that you can get in a year, but that is dictated by statute, so we could go and ask for that as part of a change that we can ask WAM and 6 cities to look at, but that's dictated by statute, and we just put it in our ordinances as the same, so.
Mr. Mayor, if I may ask, so Fleur, is that different for facilities like the Lyric and David Street Station and so on? I thought those conditions happen to be a little bit more unique. I may be confused though.
So there is something we call a special malt beverage permit, and that is a yearly license for malt beverages, but that's only malt beverage. For full catering, if you want to have other types of alcohol, then you need to have a catering.
Thank you.
And for example, if the hall on A Street were to be bought by Vintage Wine and Spirits, they could only cater to that particular spot 32 times in a year, even though they own both of them, which that isn't even once a week, which kind of limits the ability to own something along those lines for a private. It's a disincentive for people to wind up trying to do those types of things and occupy other spaces with bigger venues.
And Mr. Mayor,
That's where I was coming from.
right,
Yeah.
right, and that's a very good example, because in the case where Mr. Huff owns both the Yellowstone Garage and the Hall on Ash,
Mm-hmm.
he was only able to cater to the Hall on Ash for that amount of time because the Hall on Ash did not have a license available for its operation, but
Exactly
Yellowstone did.
Yep.
So yeah, so I mean, I do want to remind that this is a conversation that I think the other municipalities around the state, 6 cities, had the conversation. As I know, there was some frustration from as a here as well, the limit of bar and grills and things like that, to help open that up for other people. And I know they were very enthusiastic about a lot of those. The tavern, they were very enthusiastic about that as well. And so, yeah.
So 2 things. First of all, back to what Bruce was saying. As far as the $1,500, you know, for a license was originally sold to everybody, or every one of those were sold for $1,500. But from that point on, they turn around now they sell for $250 or $300. I think Travis Taylor's went for over $350. So in a way, I agree with what you're saying, but in a way I don't, because I mean, if we have a license to put out, I mean, right now you get a full retail liquor license for $1,500 if we put it out there, but you can't even buy a bar and grill and get to pay $10,000 for it. And we're talking about doing $90,000 for a tavern, but yet you can do more with a retail liquor license. So, personally myself, I think if those go out there, that price does need to go up because of the fact that this $1,500 for a full retail, you've got the gamut to do whatever you want, and it's rock bottom. But if we want somebody to do a bar and grill, unless they, you know, they were unlimited, but you're going to pay 8 times what you would for a full retail. And then the other thing that I would ask is on when it comes on the catering thing, is there a way that we can get somebody from the state just to clarify that? Because I was pretty sure we had a conversation, and I think that with the Hall and Ash is a good example. I thought they said that it depended on, you were pretty much at liberty with the law to, however you broke it up. If you wanted to split the Hall and Ash in half and call it room A and room B, then you have 36 catering permits in room A and 36 in B. And if you had a building that was 5 stories tall and you wanted to divide it up into A, B, and C, well, pretty soon you could have unlimited catering permits. So if that's still that same way, I think that's important information for everybody here to have when it comes down to catering permits, how exactly that works.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, I think that's exactly how it works. And the other question I would ask, and again, I probably have to defer to you, Fleur, is that 36 for the building, or is that 36 per vendor who wants to use that building?
Yes, it's 36 per vendor per location.
Okay.
An organization that's requesting. So, and then yes, you can break up the rooms. So at a place like the Hall and Ash, where it's just one big room, you could break it up, but it'd be awkward to not have people go into that other side. But at a place like Walcott Gallery, where you have different rooms, then, you know, it's quite a few.
I think that was the Hall's problem, is that it's one room.
Exactly.
Right. Not a problem for him anymore.
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm going to try to organize my thoughts as I say this. I guess I personally would be open to having the conversation either through WHAM or otherwise to reevaluate the sorts of liquor distribution opportunities we as municipality has. I have a very elementary understanding of how liquor licenses are currently distributed, but based on what I do know, those numbers do seem to be set fairly arbitrarily. So I think that's totally worth having that discussion. Creation of a tavern license, potentially part of that, increasing the cost of those licenses, potentially part of that, because I'd be curious to hear what the chief's thoughts are, but alcohol outlets do have a societal cost. Alcohol use is closely associated with crime. I used to work in public health and prevention, substance use prevention, and whatever path we take forward, I would like to see it based on evidence, taking into consideration things like alcohol outlet density and its correlation to crime. You know, there's a fine balance that we have to strike between providing as much opportunity for free enterprise as possible. At the same time, that comes with a societal cost, and so, you know, we're not going to get it perfect because there's no perfect balance, but I just would like us to keep that in consideration. You know, if we're talking about unlimited licenses, you know, that could potentially open up a door, I think, to having a oversaturation of those sorts of establishments, and then the chief and his department are, you know, having to clean up the mess. So that's where I stand, you know, open to this conversation, open to reevaluating those numbers, but I would like to see us, whatever we come to conclusions on, that it's based on evidence out there as far as public health, crime, and other topics. So, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, you make a great point, and I would certainly say that would be the exact reason that these ideas would suggest local control and local authority. Because at this point in time, as you correctly identified, the state gets to tell you how many you get. And it may be a saturation issue, or it may be dramatically underserved. What we're suggesting, you know, as a sort of a theme pertaining to these ideas is give the council in that community the opportunity to make those decisions and not leave it with legislators down in Cheyenne who could care less about how successful Casper is or isn't in this environment. And so I think those are great sort of rubrics to consider, but we got to get it to local authorities so you have the opportunity to consider those things.
Sure. Thank you.
But do you need anything? Is that just more informational?
Well,
I know we're going into resolution, so.
Mr. Mayor, what would be helpful would be to at least have the council be willing to entertain draft resolutions to bring forward, so that with, you know, some or all of these ideas, I would know where you're at and therefore know what to advocate to WHAM that, you know, ostensibly could be brought into some sort of bill later on down the road.
That's Council Phil. Alvin?
Thank you. We will prepare something and get your take. Thank you.
Thanks, Carter. Appreciate it. Is that all it?
That's it. Yes,
All
sir.
right.
Absolutely.
All right, council around the table. We'll go ahead and start with Sean. Kyle?
Couple things. At a Casper Housing Authority board meeting last Thursday, we discussed the Roosevelt building being for sale, their progress on the Liberty Square project, and their continued high utilization of emergency housing vouchers. Again, one of the highest utilization rates in the whole country. So they're doing a great job taking advantage of that program. They have their annual Father's Day event coming up on June 18th from 11 to 3 at Washington Park. So it's always a good event. Might put it on your calendar. And then just lastly, we're going to have a lot of people in town this weekend between the Trump rally, the soccer tournament, graduations, and other activities. Just want to advocate to the public that we're good hosts and just be patient. I imagine it's going to affect traffic and, you know, eating out at restaurants and other things. My understanding is it's more people than we had for the eclipse. So, you know, I guess just I hope that we show ourselves as good hosts and, you know, our understanding that it's going to have some sort of impact on our commute and other activities over the weekend. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Lisa?
Last Thursday was the contractors board. We're looking at just making some changes to some of the licenses. And so I think that that's going to be helpful considerably. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the senior citizen meeting yesterday. My life kind of exploded. And then Lemonade Day, June 18th. Yeah, kind of a fun day.
Amber?
Two things. I had an Economic Development Joint Powers Board meeting at the end of last week. We welcomed a new representative from the county, Commissioner Peter Nicolason, so he'll be sort of serving on that board with us. And spent most of the meeting talking about undertaking a strategic planning process for the EDJPB itself. You know, we contract economic development out to Advance Casper, and they have, you know, they update a strategic plan every year and provide it to EDJPB as well as a budget. But decided that we would like to have one for EDJPB itself, separate from our contract agency, Advance Casper. So we're going to be undertaking that, hopefully in the near future. And I'd like to propose to council that we consider pausing enforcement of people parked on the parkways, maybe with the exception of boats, RVs, dangerous, you know, safety types of issues, while we deliberate changes to the ordinance, so people are not getting ticketed while we're in the middle of making quite a lot of changes to how we might approach that. So I wanted to put that proposal on the table for council to consider a brief pause while we resolve that issue.
Carter, is that something that we can do as kind of a direction to you, the city? How would that work?
Mr. Mayor, the council is actually the only authority that can sort of put a stay on something like this. And so I certainly wouldn't have that authority in and of myself. I wouldn't believe, and I don't think the chief would think he has that either. So if that's the interest of the council, we would certainly take that direction.
Bruce?
I can tell you, I came today to buy a permit because our parkway is paved and I've been parking on it for years, and so I decided I better come down and get the permit, and they're not available yet because I'm not on 12th or 13th Street, so we still have our 3 readings. So I think that's a really good idea because I know some people have been getting ticketed for it. So if we could put it just to stay on it until we at least revamp the ordinance, which I know first reading is next week. So we'd only be asking for, 6 weeks or so, just until, so people have a clear cut, defined idea of what it is we're wanting them to do. I think that's a fantastic idea.
Council okay with that first day?
Thank you.
Bruce?
Well, that was one of the things I was bringing up, so good job. And then Kyle brought up the other, I know my daughter's coming to town to play in the soccer. I know Trump's going to be here. And the revenue it's going to bring Casper is going to be incredible. So the more patient we are, the more money it brings in, the more money we have to do things to help our people. So, like Kyle said, try to be patient, try to be a good host. And my wife had her surgery last week, and for those that have been following and praying for us, and everything went amazing. We are now living on our own. We have no more health care. Things have really turned the corner for us. So I want to thank everyone for all the prayers, the good thoughts. It's been an amazing community experience for me. And lastly, I just want to say this publicly, and probably Zalima, I should have said it in front of your employees, but I'm not opposed to giving our people raises at all. I just didn't want to commit to doing that here before we got into budget, when we have 500 and some employees that we need to be concerned about. So not opposed against any of that stuff. I just wanted to make sure it was done in the right steps, and so that's all I have. Thanks.
Thanks. Steve Cappy.
Basically, we had a police block party last Wednesday that was not well attended by the members around the table here, but it appeared to be a very good opportunity for the people to get out and meet the police and meet the public, and I thought it was very well put on, Chief. So, thank you, and I hope the people had a good response. I have not heard how it compared to last year. But, so we had a little better turnout. Very good.
I was in Vegas, Chief, right up in there.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing.
How are you? Steve.
Seeing if our starts here in a couple weeks, and I will not be here on the 7th. That's it.
Awesome. Steve and I both have seniors graduating this year.
Nice.
And so they will be graduating on Thursday. So congratulations to Kelly Walsh, Roosevelt NC this weekend. And so looking forward to that. So yeah.
You got any kids left at home?
One.
Matter of fact, aren't they doing the graduation at the event center, and then they have to turn around and,
Yes.
Thursday.
because that one's indoor too. Trump's indoor, right?
Outdoor.
Oh, it's 55% chance of rain that day.
Oh.
I figured it was, so, because of the rain chances, but that's going to be a heck of a strain on our crew up there.
Yeah. Which is, yeah, so they're going to be working hard this weekend. That was the other thing I was going to say, because graduation and the rally that's coming up. So thank you for them and all the hard work that they're all doing. We appreciate it. We know it's going to be busy. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing. Thank you. The museum has opened now in Du Bois, and the reviews coming out of there are literally unbelievably incredible. In fact, they're getting so inundated with people coming that they are now trying to provide transit anywhere from 15 to 25 minutes out, where you park and they bring you in on a bus, because I guess it's amazing. So I just wanted to say we got a little flack for moving the ship up there, and I'm glad we did, because it's going to be seen by so many people now. So good job on the council for that. Thank you.
As an add-on, they added another tank on Monday.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. I was going by there when the tank was turning in. It took the whole road.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Have a good Memorial weekend, too.
Thanks, everybody.
She very bluntly told me that she did not want to hear from me because I was biased.
Okay, thank you. You didn't catch a name, did you?
I didn't.
I didn't recognize her.
So, yeah,
In the end,
I tried. Said she did not want to hear